All right, well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming along. Today I'm going to be speaking about a project that has only very recently concluded, called Encounters, which was a collaborative project between the SocialNUI Centre here in the Interaction Design Lab and the Victorian College of the Arts. It was a very large project, which I'll talk about in a moment. But before we get started, I want to just show a short video. This was a teaser video that was prepared about Encounters. And we have actually got a full video being prepared at the moment. It wasn't quite ready in time for today, but when it is, you'll probably see that as well. So this gives you a sense of the sorts of things that Encounters was about. Encounters is a collaborative project between the Microsoft SocialNUI Centre and the VCA, whereas it's part of the Somersault Festival, and we want people to just come along and enjoy themselves and discover the installation for themselves. It includes a whole range of visual effects and sound effects and music and composition and lighting, all tied together using a Microsoft Kinect sensor and some wearable technology as well. So, as you can tell, Encounters was an interactive art installation. It took place in the Somersault Festival, which was over January and February in the Arts Precinct in Southbank. And it took place over 4 Saturday evenings from 7 p.m. till 11 p.m. The last one was White Night, so it took place from 7 p.m. to 2 a.m. So what I'm going to talk about today is, first of all, the team. This is a very large project with a very large team, so I want to just make sure that we know how many people were involved in the kind of the scope of the project. I want to talk about what drew us to doing this project in the first place. And then I'll talk a lot about the design of the physical space and also some of the interaction design. The research questions that we were trying to explore in doing Encounters. The technology and how that worked, because that's quite a big part of our contribution to the project. I'll talk about some of the artistic elements as best I can, from my understanding from talking to the artists about what they were trying to do with all of the different things that they'd created. And then I'll talk in a little bit of detail about some of the research findings and some of the insights that came out from the research components of the project too. And finally, I'll talk about where this is going in terms of future work that we're doing in the SocialNUI Centre and also in collaboration with the VCA. So Encounters was a very, very large project. It had multiple sub-teams that were working kind of in parallel on different things. So we had visual artists who were preparing a lot of visual assets that ended up being used for lots of different reasons. We had composers, one of whom sitting in the back there, Thomas, who created the soundscape for the whole installation, both the soundtrack and also kind of sound effects that were used throughout the installation. We had dancers who contributed by actually doing dance performances as part of the installation as well. We had people from the SocialNUI Centre who were software developers who built the technology for the Kinect that was used for the system. We had researchers, again from the SocialNUI Centre, so Mitchell, Niels and Sarah, who participated in the research component of the project and tried to figure out how people were making sense of the installation. And then we also had a production team as well, which Paul over there was the main person for the production side of things as well, and make sure that the installation actually ran and that we had something to show every week. So all in all, there were about 40 people involved in the project, and this is most but not all of the people. So it's, as you can see, it's a very large group distributed among all of those subgroups. So the reason that we wanted to do this project was, first of all, to work within the SocialNUI's public spaces theme, to explore social interaction in public spaces and how technology can both affect and also can mediate social interactions in public spaces. And related to that, we wanted to understand how NUI technologies in particular, natural user interfaces, things like body and gesture and speech, how those can be used in public installations. We wanted to develop technology that we could take and use for other projects as well. I'll talk a bit about that later on. And we also wanted to engage very much so in collaboration with the VCA, with students and staff there. And finally, this was an opportunity for us to participate in the Somersault Festival, which was funded by the university and by the City of Melbourne and various other stakeholders. So it was a good opportunity to get the SocialNUI name out there and to be involved in the community. So in terms of the design of Encounters, It really started off with some discussions that we had at the VCA with the director of the VCA, Sue Baker, talking about what potential types of interactive technologies and installations could make use of the VCA space. The VCA, for those of you who might not have been there, has a large courtyard, kind of in one of the central areas in the VCA. Where it was really thought that it was a great location for some sort of interactive installation. So it really started off with a discussion about space. And just to give some bearings if you're not sure, this is Southbank Boulevard down here. The VCA campus is here, and we used this courtyard here. This area, Dodge Street, was part of the Somersault Festival. This was their festival hub. So there were lots of other installations and activities going on that street as well. So the installation started off being built around this idea of space. And that inflected the design in a few different ways. First of all, this was a very large space compared to a gallery or some other place that you might have other artwork, and also compared to the sorts of places that we would typically put interactive technologies. We expected to have large numbers of participants, and indeed we had almost 1,200 participants for the duration of the installation. So we wanted to make sure that we allowed for that in the design. We weren't just allowing one person to come in and experience it at the time and then leave. That was a big part of it too. And relatedly, we wanted to make sure that we had multiple output modalities. So we wanted to allow for lots of different types of interactions. It wasn't just going to be you go there and move your hand around and something changes on a screen. It needed to be a bit different and a bit more subtle and nuanced than that. So when we thought about how to go about tracking people within a space like this, the obvious answer was to use something like a Kinect sensor. Typically, Kinect is used for skeletal tracking, and when you do that, it works very well, but it doesn't work well when you've got lots of people for various reasons. You can end up with occlusion, where people are blocked by the path of the sensor, and also the Kinect sensor only tracks 6 people at a time, which is more than enough for a home or a domestic situation. It's not when you're dealing with a space this size as part of a public festival. So we decided to instead put the sensor overhead. And in doing this, we'd get a much wider field of view, and we'd also get a top-down perspective, which gave us some interesting possibilities for the sorts of things that we could pull out of the data. So if we started to do some playing around with these ideas of looking at how to actually do this, how to place a sensor overhead and what that meant. And when we did that, we started looking at the trigonometry involved, basically, and what you could actually do with this. So if you place a Kinect sensor 5 meters overhead, then you end up with a field of view of about 70 degrees horizontally, which means you get a space that's about 7 meters wide. 60-degree vertical pitch means you get about 5.86 meters depth. So that's the space that you can kind of track with a sensor that's placed 5 meters overhead. So it stops becoming about the number of skeletons you can track, and starts becoming about the amount of space that you can track. And so if we put a person in that space, one of the issues that we discovered early on is that the way that the Kinect sensor works is that it kind of, you can see it almost like a cone. It also, in a sense, projects or takes a cone of the area, which means that somebody standing at the edge of this space, you might catch their legs, but you wouldn't catch their heads with the sensor. So we had to basically truncate the space in order to be able to make any sense of the data that we were getting. So we basically moved people inside this area that was roughly 5 meters by 5 meters. And that was the area that we ended up using as kind of the tracked area for the system. This was done after a lot of experimentation. So this was some early testing that we did. When I say early, it was actually in, I think, early December. It was a very short project as well. So we tried different heights and different positions and different situations to see how the Kinect sensor would respond, and also to see what information we could get out of the sensor as well. And so I particularly like this image. It's kind of spot the Kinect, but this was pretty typical of the sorts of testing we were doing. And we also had to test with lots of different types of people, and given this was a public festival, we had to test with kids, which presented some interesting challenges and technical challenges as well as logistical challenges. We started talking very early on about the way that we would start designing the actual physical infrastructure that we'd need to build encounters. And this was a very early drawing that Frank actually drew, and when we were talking about this, trying to come up with some different ideas for how to suspend a Kinect 5 meters in the air. It's not actually a very easy thing to do. If you have a tree or something fixed in place, then you can kind of make it work, but you don't want to put it on a pole because you'll get occlusion from the pole. It kind of needs to be suspended in such a way that there's nothing immediately below it or right next to it, and that's actually a really complicated problem. So Frank's looked at this idea. We ended up pricing this out and it was going to be enormously expensive. So then we switched to a slightly different idea where we had these 3 platforms, and that's a version of this is what we ended up using. So we for this particular iteration, we thought about having a screen in the central area of the courtyard and have the screen actually on the ground. We played around with this idea a lot, talked about it a lot with the artists and the other collaborators, and then we kind of shifted to a slightly different model, which was getting closer and closer to what we ended up with. We iterated on this a bit more, and then finally ended up with a situation where we had 3 arches that were 5 meters by 5 meters in dimension, as well as a very large structure housing a very large screen. That was a custom engineered structure to make this all work. We had 24 lights, so separate lighting systems. We had 18 speakers and 3 subwoofers. So there was a lot of stuff going on, basically. There was a lot of infrastructure required. And this is what it looked like on the night. So the screen was really the centerpiece of people's interaction when they came in. That was kind of the thing that drew people's attention into the space. It was roughly a 5 meter by 4 meter screen, so very large. The quality is actually a lot better than the screen here, which explains why when I show some videos later on, they don't actually look as particularly good on here. I've tried to adjust them a bit. They looked a lot more impressive on the actual screen we were using, which is interesting. And we also decided, after a lot of discussion with the artist, to angle the screen slightly. So it wasn't just a static screen that was placed on a wall or projected like you might expect with most other interactive installations or things that you would see at White Night, for example. This was to make it look a little bit unusual, a little bit different, but also to encourage a sense of participation and movement throughout the space, and also to change the perspective slightly as well. And you get some unusual effects when you're looking at it from different angles. While we were doing all of this testing and discussion about the layout of the space, we were also collaborating a lot with the VCA artists as well. So the VCA artists were predominantly students, but also quite a few staff from the VCA who participated across all of those different disciplines I mentioned. And the early workshops were really focused on trying to build an aesthetic for encounters, trying to understand what sorts of things we could do. So we were driven by the technology and by the space to try and work out how we might go about making some sort of artistic contribution in encounters. We decided on the name Encounters because it has it's got 2 connotations that I think are particularly interesting. One is it's kind of got a cosmic sense. So Encounters was actually drawn when we had some discussions in an early iteration about having kind of an alien kind of feel to the whole installation. Even though that faded as we went on, I still really like the name Encounters because it captured some of the social aspects of the installation as well, and it encouraged interactions and encounters between people, as I'll talk about shortly. The later workshops became more and more detailed, with the artists presenting the work that they were doing and the ideas they were having, and using them as an opportunity to collaborate and to discuss how things work together. So the visual artists and the composers and the dancers were all talking together about how they were creating a unified aesthetic. And then we, of course, as the technologists, would come in and talk about how that fit into what we were developing and what we were able to pull out of the sensor. So there was very much a collaborative back and forward project. And I think it's safe to say that pretty much everybody involved in the project has said this is one of the most collaborative things that they've ever participated in. That's certainly the case for me. There were so many people involved, and yet everybody was really enthusiastic and happy to contribute to everyone else's ideas. We also had the dancers as well, and this was something that people find a little bit unexpected. But the role of the dancers, well, there were actually 3 roles that the dancers played in encounters. The first one was that they were, of course, performative. The dancers performed during the events, and they actually took that very seriously and treated the events as performances. But that was really only one part of the role. Another part was that they were, in some sense, an instructor, or a way of understanding or allowing people to understand what the installation was and how they could interact with it. So some of this took place essentially by being demonstrators of particular interactions, and you'll see some examples of this shortly. And the third way that dancers got involved was through encouraging interactions between members of the public as well. So they did this quite explicitly as well as implicitly. And again, I'll come back to this in a little bit. Some of the dancers emphasized different aspects of these 3 roles. And altogether we had, I think we had 6 dancers in total, but we had 3 at a time who were participating, and 3 of them were kind of the core, part of the core team. So in terms of the research that we were trying to do with encounters, this was a research project as much as it was an artistic project and a fun thing to do. We wanted to first of all understand how do people make sense of the installation and of their interactions with it. We had some interesting interaction design challenges to work through when we were designing this, and I'll talk about those a bit more shortly. So that was the first core question. The second question was, how do people respond socially to the installation? And the third is, how do the dancers influence participants' understanding, participation, and also their sociality through encounters? I'm going to just tell you ahead right now that we don't have answers to these questions yet because we're still working through the analysis. I will talk about some preliminary findings that we've got coming out of the data so far, but I won't be addressing these questions specifically today, but keep an eye out for future publications, which will. So I'd like to talk in a lot more detail now about the technology because this was our core contribution as the SocialNUI Centre, and it's also something that we're able to take and use in lots of other projects as well. So this was conducted by, this was predominantly constructed by Diego, Manuel, Giuliano, and Zaha, with help from various other people. And basically the idea was to start processing this data that we were getting from a Kinect sensor suspended overhead. That might seem like an easy task, it's not. So if you imagine what you're getting from an overhead sensor, this is what actually the sensor saw. This is a real image from one of the arches. So you can see that we can kind of make out somebody's head. That's actually Manuel. We can make out shoulders. Depending on their angle compared to the center of the area, we can also get some part of their body. And we can also start to get a sense of the spatial relationships between people. So we can sense how far people are from each other. But getting that information out is really challenging. So the Kinect sensor has lots of different cameras in it. The camera that we're looking at here is the RGB camera, red, green, blue, which is basically a webcam. But it also has an infrared camera. And so we can look at the whole environment in infrared. And this is a very common thing to do because it basically takes all the color out, which makes the image a lot easier to process. Kinect tries to add in, oopsie, sorry, I've lost my position. Start this again.
John, that's on grass, isn't it?
It is, yes. So Kinect also tries to find skeletons because that's what it does, and it has some quite amusing results. It actually didn't do too badly in this case, but other times it would find skeletons where there weren't any, so we turned that off. But it also gives us a depth map, which is the image that we actually ended up processing. So this is basically taking the infrared image, doing some processing on it, and you can get a sense of where people are in space by looking at this. The reason we use the depth map is because we can create a very high contrast image, which is really important when we're doing computer vision, as I'll talk about shortly. So in terms of the end-to-end process, we knew that we had a Kinect sensor, and we knew that we had all of the assets that the artists were creating. We had the visuals, we had the sound, and we had lighting. The question was how to make them tie together. So this is a very common problem in computer vision. Identifying people from an unusual angle is very easy for humans to do. But it's very hard for computers to do. It's very hard to describe to a computer how to make this work. So in this case, for example, a human can look at this image and see, well, there's a person there, there's a person there, person there, person there, and there's two people up there. But one immediate challenge that you can start to think of is, well, in the very top, how do you know that's one person, two people and not one person? How do you distinguish between those? So we used the depth camera, as I said. This is what this image is. We basically did some processing on the depth image to normalize the image slightly. And then we ended up being able to do what's called contour detection, which is basically finding shapes within an image. And based on that, we were able to get a few bits of information out of the image almost immediately. The first one was the X position, so where somebody was on one axis. We could get the Y position, where they were on another axis. We could get the Z position, because the Kinect camera uses depth sensors, so we were able to detect where they were in relation to the sensor. And we were also able to detect their area, so how much space they were taking up within the field of view. So that was the first part of the process, was to do contour detection, to try and figure out where people were and to get some very basic information about the sorts of objects that we could see. But that wasn't enough. The second point was tracking people. Now, it's very easy, again, for humans to do this. If we look at this image, we can see that, for example, this person is moving, kind of following my pointer. But that's a very, very difficult thing for a computer to understand as well, because computers don't see moving images the way that humans do. Humans have visual processing that's been evolved to look for this sort of movement, and there's a whole branch of Gestalt psychology that looks about the sorts of rules that we use to infer movement where these sorts of static images are presented. But when there's a computer that's being presented just with static images, a sequence of static images, trying to tell it that person is the same as the person that was in a slightly different position earlier is really, really challenging. So Giuliano, Manuel, and Zaha created a tracking algorithm using basically some heuristics that were looking at how far a person could move within a certain amount of time. The Kinect sensor sends out data about 30 times a second. So we were able to get timestamps for all the information we were getting from the sensor, able to do some processing on that to look at, well, what's the maximum distance that we could reliably expect somebody to be moving within a particular fraction of a second. And based on that, you can start to form some rules around, well, if a person was over here 1 frame ago and they're over here now, that's probably a different person. We'll assign them a different ID. So tracking people was a really core part to some of the other aspects of the work we wanted to do as well. So once we were able to track, we ended up with a blob ID. So this was basically, a blob, I should say, is an object that's being tracked by the sensor. It basically represents a person. So we had the blob ID. And then once we had the blob ID, we were able to start calculating some other things as well. We were able to calculate, for example, how long ago did we first see this blob? Because we were tracking them over time, we could basically say, well, when did that blob enter? This wasn't 100% reliable. In fact, it wasn't even 80% reliable, but it was enough that we could get a sense of how long people had stuck around on the platform for. And that actually became really important to some of the visual design that I'll talk about shortly. We also can calculate things like the velocity. So we can calculate this instantaneously as well as over time. So we can calculate the speed at which somebody is moving. We can also calculate the direction that they're moving in as well. And again, these were all parameters that the artist then had to use or then had available to them to create the work. So at this stage, we had contour detection, we had tracking, but there were still more pieces missing. So one thing that Manuel spent a very long time on was this next point, which is, if you imagine you've got a Kinect sensor suspended 5 meters above you, and you look at the depth that you're seeing from a particular blob, so let's say it's above me and it's kind of getting this depth here, you might see a pattern like this. So what that suggests is that the person is moving slightly further away from the sensor and then all of a sudden moving towards the sensor and then back to a neutral position. This is obviously heavily stylized. And of course that represents this action, which is jumping. And you would be surprised at how difficult it is to recognize jumping. Manuel spent a very long time on trying to figure out how to do this. So we basically recognize a pre-jump crouch and then the actual jump. And you can kind of get a signal out of that, but it's not 100% reliable either. And interestingly, lots of people have very different ways of jumping, which caused a lot of headaches for Manuel as well. Absolutely, yeah. Now we had multiple people standing in the space, and so we thought, well, if we've got multiple people, then we want to start looking at some of these social effects. After all, this is designed to be an installation about social encounters. So we, first of all, we thought about the situation I mentioned before, where you have these sorts of ambiguous situations where you have two people standing very close together, and it's difficult for a computer to distinguish them. We decided rather than try and spend a lot of time trying to solve that as if it was a problem, we'd instead take advantage of it and treat it as actually a piece of information we could use. So we built it into the encounters design. We considered these cases where people move together, and we considered that to be what we called a cluster. So that was, in other words, a situation where two people had joined together as far as the computer was concerned, and so we treated them as one object with special properties. And those special properties manifested themselves in terms of the visual design, the sound design, and it also meant that we could get a rough sense of how many people were actually in a cluster as well. So we could actually calculate through some various tricky means. We could calculate an estimated number of people within a group that was put together. We also could calculate other aspects that were related to the whole space as well. So for example, in this case, there are 3 blobs that we're tracking. This one is a cluster, but these 3 blobs are very far apart. And so we'd say that this is a highly dispersed platform, or we call them platforms. They're basically the spaces under the arches. In comparison, these are the same 3 blobs standing close together, and so we'd say this has a low dispersion. And so this has a meaning in terms of the social relationships between the people. This is basic proxemics, essentially, that people standing together have some sort of different social characteristics than people standing further apart. We were also able to calculate crowdedness as well, so how busy the platform was. So in this case, there are 3 people standing far apart and they're not taking up a huge amount of space. So we'd say that this platform has low crowdedness in comparison to this one, where there are a lot of people standing in the space and therefore it's a very crowded platform. And so this information again was made available to the artists to be able to do different types of things with. And the final piece of information that we were able to extract out of what we collected so far was what we call the centroid. So this was basically, if you imagine the area under the sensor was kind of balanced in some way, this would be the center point at which it was balanced. So if there was nobody on the platform, then the center point would be the very middle. But if you added a person in, that center point would move towards that person. If you added 2 people in and had one of them be a cluster, for example, then a center point would be in a very different location. So with this, we could use that information for various types of sound effects and other types of interactions as well. So we had all this information that we'd picked up. We'd basically taken the contours, we'd done some tracking on it, and we'd made some inferences about what was going on. And we still had to do one last piece to really get that into the hands of the artists. So we collected all this data. This was the information that we ended up being able to capture from the sensors and be able to infer. So we calculated this for 3 separate arches, 3 platforms, and we did it at 30 times per second, which is a very computationally intensive thing to do. So taking all this information in from the sensor and then turning it into structured data about 15 different blobs on each platform, so 45 in total. And for each of those, we had all this information plus the social information I was mentioning before. So there's a lot of information that we were able to calculate at a very high frequency and then provide that to the artists. And we did that in a format called OSC, Open Sound Control, which is a standardized protocol that is used in digital arts for transmitting. It's basically a structured data format for transmitting information. So that's how we were able to turn this, well, after we filtered it to this, into this, which is basically the circles represent blobs that we're tracking, and then ultimately an even more abstract representation, which was this.
John, how quickly did the clusters come together in initial state? I know there's a lot of work that you're basically doing, but did you see the clusters very quickly came together and then brought apart, or were they sort of wandering first and then decided the cluster?
It varied a lot. Yeah. Well, I'll talk about some of that in a minute actually, because that comes back to some of the stuff the dancers were doing. But yeah, it varied a lot. You can see here they were forming and breaking apart as well.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. So this is actually people moving kind of in a formation together. So that's the technology that we built to make encounters work. And as I said, we're going to be doing other stuff with this technology as well. I'd like now to talk about the artistic components, and I hope you'll forgive me if I don't really speak as eloquently on this as I do on other matters, because this is quite far outside of my area of expertise, but I will give it my best shot anyway. Before I completely go off the technology though, I'd like to just point out that I made a massive simplification in the last diagram where I said that the OSC turned into sound, lights and vision. In actual fact, these systems were enormously complicated systems in and of themselves. And there was a whole lot of moving parts inside these to make them work as well. Just as an example, I'll just take sound. The sound system looked more like this. There were actually multiple, and I've probably forgotten some layers actually. Mark can tell me if I've forgotten anything. Excellent, that's good, I was listening. But yeah, so there were lots of different pieces of software, lots of hardware, all processing with the data as well. So we'd send the OSC data off to the artist systems, and then they in turn would do all sorts of crunching on it and processing, creating sound, processing the sound, and then finally it would end up in the speakers. So that's by way of just talking about the technical contribution the artists made as well. I don't want to understate the amount of technical work they had to do to make this work either. As far as the aesthetic goes for the compositional side, the music and the sound side of encounters, there were a few different goals that the composers had for this. And Tom, correct me if I'm going to get into this wrong. So first of all, they were trying to support the fact that encounters is all about exploration and discovery, and playfulness. So the sounds that you heard and that you'll hear again in a second are very kind of inviting and not intended to be kind of clinical or constraining. And they were intended to be, it was intended to be a very ambient soundtrack as well. It wasn't something that you'd go in just to listen to the music. You'd kind of be listening to it as you participate and as you interact. So it was there to support the interaction rather than to be the focus of the installation. And it was also, because we had so many speakers, we had 18 speakers and 3 subwoofers, we were able to spatialize the audio as well. So the audio was specific to the place that you were standing. So if you moved around the space, you'd hear different sounds, even from the same data coming in. So here's an example of some sounds. So it's a little bit hard to make out there, but there are some distinct, first of all, there's sound effects that you could hear. That sound that you could hear repeatedly was the jumping sound that people would kind of discover almost by accident and then do over and over again to kind of trigger it again and again. There were also sounds where people entered or exited the space. And then there was also an underlying sound loop or actually several sound loops that were playing as well. And those got more and more complex and more interactive, essentially, the more people that were in the space. So the idea was that the whole installation, the sound especially, was responding to not only the activity of people, but also just the mere presence of people. So that brings me to the visual design as well. So there was another group of artists that focused on the visual design for encounters. And they created 6 distinct visual aesthetics. Now you remember that I said that we had a kind of a cosmic theme to encounters. You'll see that represented in the visual themes especially. Each of the visual artists created their own distinct style that was used. And each used different information from the sensor in different ways. So some of them represented some of the data and not others. Others represented other parts of the data. And I'll give you some examples in a moment of how that actually looked on the screen. But all of them, as I said, were based around this common theme of cosmic interactions and also promoting social interactions between people. So one of the aesthetics, and again, I apologize for the quality on the screen. It's not as good as it was on the actual screen. One of the aesthetics was created by Kathy Ann, one of the visual artists. And you'll see that it's kind of a very planetary idea. As you move around, I believe this one you get a tail attached to your planet, depending on how fast you run. I think that was what it was. There's quite a few visual aesthetics, they get muddled up in my head. But as you can see those tails appearing, that's basically representing some of that data that we were able to capture out of the center. A second aesthetic was by Emily. So I believe she actually hand drew these and then put them into the system from that. And they kind of had a really interesting quality to them, which was a lot more organic feeling, I guess. And so clusters were represented differently than individual people who were moving around. And again, some of the data that was captured was represented in different ways. This was a very different aesthetic by Joe, who created a much more kind of cartoony feel, but it was still obeying that same aesthetic. And Leanne created a very different aesthetic. It's still, if you look at it at a glance, it still looks like a kind of a cosmic theme, but this was very different. This was actually using letters, and in the background of the stars there, you can actually see their letters as well. And the idea here was to get people interacting with each other in a more explicit way, so that people would work together to create words and phrases on screen, and that actually happened quite a lot. When this visual aesthetic appeared, then people would kind of work together to make words appear or to make names appear. And that people could jump, and that would change the letter that they were assigned to. Max created this aesthetic. This was kind of based on a retro video game feel. And with this aesthetic, the longer you stayed on the platform, the longer your blob was tracked for, basically, the different sort of property you would get on the screen. So it would start off with very simple little dots, like you can see here, and it would end up with very complicated little shapes being created over time. And finally, Steve is a 3D artist, and he created a very rich kind of visual experience. So again, it's very planetary based, but this is using a lot of different types of animation and different effects. And this one is actually very resource intensive. If I run this on my laptop for too long, it starts to get very hot because there's a lot of processing going on just on the visual side for this, as well as, of course, all the Kinect processing. So, so as I said, all of these different aesthetics use different pieces of data from the sensor in different ways. They represented things in different ways. And the way this worked was basically Travis, one of the visual artists, actually constructed a program that would kind of cycle through these aesthetics. We changed the nature of this quite a lot over the period of the 4 weeks. We ended up going with 10-minute long blocks, so each aesthetic would appear for about 10 minutes, and then would change to the next one. And that basically gave people an opportunity to see an aesthetic and then to participate in another one as well, or two, if they stuck around. Now, as I mentioned, the dance also had its own kind of aesthetic as well, and its own purpose, which was, of course, to be performative, instructive, and interactive. And I'll describe some of the custom technology that we used for the dances too. But the dances took place, or the dance performances took place every 30 minutes for about 10 minutes. So we had multiple dance performances during the evenings, and the dancers got quite tired, as you can imagine. The dance performances were improvisational, but they were also structured, and the dancers spent a lot of time trying to come up with a choreography that allowed them to capture some of the ideas from the overall aesthetic of encounters, but that would also allow them to kind of respond to the audience in different ways. So the dancers had this extra level of input into the system beyond what a normal participant had. They had this piece of technology that they could wear. It's called a Myo. It's basically a wristband. And the Myo includes 3 sensors. It includes an accelerometer, which measures the arm acceleration, so the speed at which the arm is moving, essentially. It has a gyroscope, which measures the orientation of the arm. And it has electromyography, which measures, in theory, it measures the muscle tension. In practice, we found that didn't work very well at all. So we stuck to the simpler mechanisms of accelerometer and gyroscope. And what we basically did with these was we put this into the mix with all the other data. So when dancers were on stage, there was basically this extra set of information coming through. And the system responded in different ways to their movements, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So the idea was that, so one of the other composers, Amy, created a special set of compositional assets, so they were basically loops and sound effects specific to the dancers. And that allowed the dancers to move their arm and to basically play melodies as they did so. So they could move their arm and a piano kind of sound would play in different ways. You'll hear some of this in a moment when I play another video. The dancers had 3 distinct phases to their performances. So the first one, each of these phases had distinct visuals and also distinct composition as well. So the first set the first phase was what they called an orbit, which was where they entered the space. They started to try and perform in a kind of subtle way. They made these kind of increasingly more complicated movements, but they were doing this within this context of a kind of ethereal cosmological theme. And so they did this using lots of circular movements to represent orbiting and space travel. And the idea with this phase was to integrate the dancers into the audience's own interaction space without alienating them. So they'd kind of, rather than just appearing and starting to do large performances, they'd kind of work themselves in slowly and subtly. And so this is what it looked like, where the dancer was kind of halfway through this phase. They'd appear. The dancers all had this EL wire, which is basically fluorescent wire that they could put on their costume, which, especially at night, made it really interesting to watch them. The second phase, which lasted only a couple of minutes but was a really engaging phase, was what they call gravitational pull. And the idea here was that this was an audience interaction stage, which is unusual for dance performers to do this. So the idea was that the dancers in this phase actually got participants to interact with each other and with the dancers. And they, during the dance performances, the visuals on the screen had a very different aesthetic, you'll see in a moment. So the visuals on the screen were basically just dots with lines connecting them, and then some other bits and pieces around the screen as well. And the idea here was to place an emphasis on the way that people could form shapes and the ways that those shapes could move and disperse. So the dancers were, after that first phase, they'd basically try and move into this phase where they were actually getting people to hold hands and to move together. And this was exploiting some of the properties of the sensor, because when people hold hands, they're recognised as a single blob by the sensor, so they're recognised as a cluster. That had a different representation on screen, which basically was a single dot. And then when they broke apart, then they'd kind of form these geometric shapes on the screen, which were a lot more engaging and interesting.
John, did you find that most people joined the dances quite readily and said?
I'll talk about that in a minute, actually. So this is an example of what the dance looked like. So the idea is that that phase kind of builds into this point where the audience who are participating all kind of run around the platforms together to kind of experiment with the shapes that they're making on the screen and the sound effects they're triggering, and in doing so create a lot of energy and a lot of momentum. The dancers then use that momentum to kind of pull back a bit and to start to move back towards the front of the space when they transition back into being a performer. So rather than having this phase be interactive, this was more of a performance again. And this would culminate in a synchronized performance where they would actually stand in front of the screen and work together on kind of a little choreography that they prepared. So that was the role of the dancers. And over the 4 weeks, encounters evolved a lot. So it started off with visuals that were very, or actually the visuals didn't really change very much over the 4 weeks. They got kind of subtly tweaked. The sound became more and more interactive over the weeks as we discovered how people were using it, and we decided to add more effects in and change the way the effects were working. The dance configuration and timing changed a lot. The lighting became more responsive, although admittedly the whole lighting system was Wizard of Oz the entire time. We could never quite get the technology hooked up with the lighting system, so there was a person at the desk controlling the lighting, but that was the only part of the system that was controlled like that. So all in all, the evolution of the project over the 4 weeks was a really important part and something that we wanted to do, and I think it gave the project a lot more momentum as well. So I'd like to just spend a few minutes now talking about the research component of the project too. So we had a lot of data that we were able to collect from this project. First of all, we had all the data that we were sending to the artist systems. We had all of that information I mentioned that we were tracking, so the positions and the relationships between all the blobs. We also had the recordings from the sensors. This is a large amount of data. We've got 20 terabytes of recordings from the sensors for the entire time, which is actually quite a logistical challenge to manage. But that is really powerful for us because it lets us go back and actually see what people did using video. And also it provides a massive corpus of data that we can use for doing other types of projects in the future. We can actually build on that data and do a lot of interesting stuff with it. We had some cameras that were watching the whole scene, and that provides some really interesting shots. I'll show some in a second. And also it provides a research angle to this as well. And then Neil, Sarah and Mitchell spent the entire time in Encounters doing research actively as well. So between them they did 125 interviews with participants, which is an enormous number for this sort of project. And they picked out a lot of interesting things. We're still making sense of a lot of that data at the moment, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And they also did observations of what people were doing and how people were responding, and talked to the artists and the people who were running the installation and tried to get a sense of how it was all playing out as well. So before I get onto the results, I just want to emphasize again that the analysis for Encounters is still heavily ongoing. We had a meeting about it yesterday. We're going to have more meetings in a couple of weeks as well when I'm back. So everything I'm going to tell you now is highly preliminary. The results may change, but I just wanted to give a selection of the sorts of things that we've been able to pick out from the data. So some of these are quantitative findings that we can get from processing the sensor data and the Kinect data. Some of these are more qualitative findings that we can get from the interviews and the observations. But don't hold me to any of these, because when we continue analysing, some of them might disappear. So the first one is more of a general observation, which was that more people participated in Encounters the later it got in the evening. So there's lots of reasons you can speculate for this. I'll come to one in a moment, which is a charitable one. So basically, this is what the participation rate looked like. It's very noisy, but basically between about 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. there's a kind of a trend line up. This is essentially the number of people that are on underneath a single arch at any given time. So it's an average of that across the entire space. So it's a reasonably good representation of how many people were in the space. We generally closed at 11 p.m. in theory every night, but in actual fact, the first 2 nights we had to close early because of weather. So that explains kind of the drop off here as well. So generally we found that, yeah, the later it got, the more people that were actually detected by the system, the more people were participating. Another reason that you could speculate for this as well, and one that I like rather than alternatives, is that the installation actually looks a lot more impressive in the dark. We did open at 7 p.m. when it was still light. We got a lot of families coming through then. But as it got darker, you'll see it starts to look a lot more engaging and impressive. Again, the screen doesn't really give it justice, but the whole installation kind of came alive the darker it got. A second finding was that the dance phases, first of all, they affected the nature of the interactions, and we're still making sense of a lot of this, and also that they encouraged people, or they seem to encourage people to stay in the space longer than they otherwise would have. So if we look at the, I'm sure I'll put the whole one on. So this is basically just looking at the time. This is kind of a snapshot of the average time people would spend in the space. And during dance phases, people generally stayed a lot longer. This is essentially the average time that they'd spend in the space. This is the number of jumps that people performed. We were able to track that over time as well. And during the dance phases, the dance actually didn't include very much or really any jumping. And so this is kind of an indication that during the dance phases, people were jumping less, which you could kind of make an inference there, it's possibly a tenuous inference, that the dancer behaviour was therefore influencing the behaviour of participants, which would support some of the ideas that we had around instruction and trying to get people to learn. But it is still a very preliminary finding. I want to emphasise that again. Another one that came up that we were quite surprised about, but then thought about, was that there seemed to be an optimal number of people underneath each arch or being detected by the system at a time. So this finding is a little bit hard to explain, but I'll do my best. So if you imagine we take a snapshot of a platform at a time where there's nobody on it, so we've got 0 people here, and we watch it for the next 25 minutes. Over the time period, basically people come into the platform, so on average it gets busier and busier until it gets to about 3 people. And it's kind of slows off at about 3. If we do that for lots of different situations where there's lots of different people on the platform at once, then we can see that they basically all converge at the same point. I'll just show these 3 just to make it a bit clearer. So the idea here is that it seems to be that once a platform, if a platform has fewer than 3 people on it, people were reluctant to go into that space. And once it had 3, then it became attractive enough that people would actually participate. And this actually mirrors a lot of findings in HCI around honeypot effects, they're called. It's basically where you need to have people using an interactive system in order to encourage other people to come in and use it as well. So it's not surprising, but it is quite a nice validation of that. But again, we'll see how it pans out once we do some more analysis. And there's a couple of reasons why this might have been. One is a honeypot effect, but another one is that 3 seems to be a good number of people to have under an arch. The reason for this is, first of all, if you imagine somebody is moving around with their arms outstretched, which a lot of people did, you're taking up a lot of room. And a 5 by 5 metre space can only really support about 3 people doing that at once. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that although we were tracking a rectangle, most people tended to form a line under the arch because they were watching the screen or talking to each other in a different way. And so in actual fact, the amount of space that they took up was such that you could only really fit 3 people in that formation at a time. There's lots of data we can use from the sensors that we can use to corroborate this. So we're going to try and track down some of the reasons behind this as well. But there's a few different explanations there for why this might have happened. Turning to some of the more qualitative findings now. Individuals that the researchers talked to had very different mental models of how encounters worked and understood in different ways, and also different rhetoric for describing how encounters worked as well. So the mental models people had were often based on their understanding of senses, which was often not very technically accurate. So for example, a lot of people thought that we were using heat to track people. I'm not sure where that came from, but perhaps the infrared sensor kind of thing gave them that idea. Another mental model was that people at the control desk were doing all the work and kind of keeping track of where everybody was using cameras and responding accordingly. We didn't have fast enough reflexes to do that, otherwise we possibly would have. But certainly, that, as I said, the only thing that was done like that was the lighting, and that was less about responding to individual people. It was more about setting the ambience. In terms of the rhetoric people used to talk about encounters when they were asked, Some people considered it to be a game or a puzzle where the idea was that they had to try and work out how their interactions affected the screen, and once they'd accomplished that, then they were kind of done. That was it. Other people considered it to be an actual piece of art, which was nice. So they were talking about it in those terms. We're still figuring out what they meant by art and how they perceived it once they decided it was art. Other people saw it as a very interactive thing, so it was kind of a thing that people came together to do interactively. And also, of course, we were part of a festival. We were part of Somersault and indirectly part of White Night. And so people were evaluating us in the context of other things that they'd seen in other installations as well. So that was another part to it as well. From an interaction design point of view, there were some interesting observations around how people actually figured out what their representation was on screen, and also sonically as well. So there were a few different strategies that we've actually pulled out so far from just doing observations and talking to people. One is that jumping was a very common way. Once people realized that jumping actually did something, especially with particular aesthetics, then they would jump in order to identify themselves. If they moved to one of the other arches, the first thing they would often do is kind of jump just to figure out who they were. And once they'd established who they were on the screen, their avatar if you like, then they were able to start moving around and using that to interact with other people. Another way was to move, and they often did this in one axis at a time. So they'd kind of do a controlled experiment essentially, just to kind of move in one way and just see what the corresponding movement was on the screen. Or just by watching what other people were doing and trying to puzzle it out that way. Similarly, they could stand still and kind of use a process of elimination to figure out which of the blobs weren't moving. Most of the time, all the blobs on the screen were moving, so this was a fairly good strategy. And also clustering and unclustering. So people would work out that by moving together, that had a different effect than if they were standing alone. So they'd actually use that as a way to figure out who they were as well. So we're trying to figure out again how people use these different strategies and if there were other strategies. But this has some implications for some of the design of these types of interactive systems and the sorts of things you can encourage and discourage with these sorts of strategies. And the next finding was around the use of space. In a lot of the ACI literature, looking at the types of interactive installations, space is generally divided into an interaction space and a non-interaction space. And there's a little bit of subtlety to it, but it's generally something that crude. Neil's put together this diagram based on encounters. So this is kind of the screen here. These are the three arches. And there are all these different shades of grey in between, where there's the space, for example, directly in front of the screen where people thought they were being tracked, but they weren't. And so we saw a lot of people trying to participate and either getting frustrated or sometimes actually just finding it very funny that they were doing stuff and they realised they weren't being tracked and kind of felt foolish. And so there was a lot of ambiguity built into the whole thing as well, that some people really enjoyed and some people really didn't. And this is very much a model that's still being played with. And you can see that here as well. So in the installation, for example, there are people explicitly inside the installation under the arch. There are people under the screen there. This kind of fence is kind of the border of the interaction space. And then there's the spectators who are either queuing to enter the installation or who were just kind of sitting back and watching, which was a very common thing for people to do, actually. There were some benches nearby where people could sit and watch, and a lot of people seemed to do that for a very long period of time. And the final thing I'll talk about is that there seemed to be different types of participants. So it wasn't just that somebody came and used it in one way and then left. So there were participants who were explorative. They were basically trying to figure out how the system worked. They would often go hunting for sensors and try and figure out the technology behind it. There were participants who were autonomous. I should say Neil's come up with all these categories. They were autonomous, so they were trying to wander around by themselves, trying to puzzle things out as they were moving around, trying to use some of those strategies I mentioned. There were participants who were very receptive to what other people were doing, so they would stand and watch either other people or watch the dancers, and once they felt like they had an idea of what was going on, then they participate. And there were also participants who were flocking, as Neil calls it, so this was actively participating in the social interactions. The dancers were a big part of this, so they would encourage this sort of behaviour. But there were also a lot of instances where this happened spontaneously, where strangers would just start interacting with each other when they realised that there were interesting effects to be had sonically and on the screen. One example of this was when some participants brought on a beach ball, and we weren't really sure what would happen, but the beach ball was recognised as an object, so it was tracked. I think it was a cluster, actually. But that provided a really interesting way for the participants to start interacting with other people. They were bouncing the beach ball around for a very long time underneath arches with strangers, between the arches. We only put a stop to it when they started trying to hit the sensor. They decided that was a step too far. There were also some other insights as well that I'll talk about that, just very briefly, that had to do with running encounters as an installation. The first thing was that Kinect sensors are really not designed to be used outdoors. We discovered this in many ways. The first way was daylight is very unkind to the sensor. In particular, grass. Grass is very reflective of infrared light. It turns out it also moves. And so we had a lot of trouble trying to isolate people from grass because the grass was causing such a havoc with the sensor. The way we ended up doing this was to use a strategy called depth slicing, where we basically had a person standing in the space and we basically ignored anything beyond a certain depth. And this actually worked reasonably well, with the caveat that when children came in, they would often be underneath that depth slice and so they disappear. Thankfully, as it got later in the evening, we were able to tweak the parameters so that that stopped being an issue. So kids were...
Kids came in, so hey, it didn't matter anyway.
And we actually had quite a few situations where the kids didn't even care that they weren't being tracked. They thought they'd follow somebody else's blob, and that was good enough for them. So it didn't seem to make a huge difference, but technically it irritated us, but we couldn't find a better way of solving it. The other one which really did my head in was the rain. 3 out of the 4 weekends we had rain in some form. This was actually on white night. This was about 2 hours before we opened on white night. And Paul came up with a great solution to weatherproof the computers running the whole system, which was to put them inside these little containers. So that worked really well for keeping them dry. Unfortunately, it had another effect, which was that the computers got very hot, and then even hotter and hotter, and they got up to 100 degrees inside. And it turns out what happens with these computers when they get to 100 degrees is that they cool themselves down by slowing themselves down. At one stage on white night, we were dealing with computers that were running at 800 megahertz, trying to run all of the Kinect systems. So we were basically running Kinects with all of that data being processed 30 times a second using 1995 technology. So we did that basically, we did that for a few minutes, discovered the frame rate dropped from 30 frames per second to 4. And at that stage, we then decided to ask Paul to shut down the installation and go and take the lids off, and then the computers cooled down and everyone was happy. But that was a lot of stress on 3 of the 4 nights that happened. The other challenge we faced too was encouraging participation from participants. So dancers really did this both explicitly by inviting participants to come in and participate, and also implicitly by just kind of moving around and being there. Volunteers who were actually running the installation did this as well. So they'd actually go and invite people and get them to come in and try and explain a little bit about what we were doing without giving it all away. But we did have challenges where some people just were not interested in staying around long enough to figure things out. So they'd kind of get the sense, they'd walk in, and as far as they were concerned, there was this random jumble of stuff on the screen and then the sound, and then they just walk away. I'm not sure what we could have done differently about that. There's certainly lessons we'll try and draw about the interaction design for these installations, but overall it seemed to work pretty well, but there were these situations. And we also had the situations where people didn't respond in the way that we expected to the dancers. So a lot of the time it was worked exactly as planned, but there were certain periods where dancers would come out and then everybody would kind of stop and then move back and let the dancers perform, which of course wasn't our intention. But, and so the dancers tweaked the performance as they went to try and change this, but that's one of the challenges of running these sorts of combined performance and interactions, is that people have kind of this model of once a performance starts, they should sit down and watch, whereas this was still intended to be interactive. So that was an interesting finding, and again, we're still playing around with what to do with these. So in terms of future work that we're going to be doing with encounters, first of all, we're looking, as I said, to do further analysis on all the data we've collected. There's still a lot of work to do with that. We've got publications we want to write. We've got some ideas for those. So Mitchell, Sarah and I are working with a lot of the people at the VCA to do this. We're also talking about what other collaborations we might be able to do with the Encounters team and also with the VCA broadly. We're still working that out as well. We're talking about whether we can run encounters again in other contexts, so actually taking the installation and running it again somewhere. A lot of people are interested in doing that, but there's enormous technical and logistical challenges to doing that, so we're not sure if that'll happen. And but what we are doing definitely is reusing this technology. So we're first of all reusing it for other projects, but we're also building on it as well. So Manuel, Zaha and myself are working on completely changing the way that the overhead tracking works to try and explore some different techniques for doing this and what other data we can collect out of the information. So there's a lot of technical work that we can do to improve this as well. And for a lot of the SocialNUI work that we want to do in the future, would be very much assisted by having the ability to track people moving through a space and to be able to infer things about their behaviour based on what the sensor can see. So we're doing a lot of work with that as well. So with that, I will conclude, and I'll just say thank you again to the entire team, who I don't want to claim credit for everything that I talked about in the presentation today, because it was very much a collaborative group effort from everybody. So thank you again. Now, I'm aware it's 4 o'clock, so if you need to run, then that's fine. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to take a couple before we head off. Sonia.
I was interested, you were mentioning 3 research questions at the beginning, and I was wondering, did you formulate these research questions right at the beginning, and that development to installation was kind of guided by this research question, or did you come up with something interesting and thinking, what do you want to explore with that?
It was a bit of both. So there were the 3 research questions. I think 2 of them we really had in mind from the start. Which was around how technology in public space and in these sorts of installations could be used, those essential questions. The one about dance and the impact of the dancers, that came about because we had the dancers involved. When we started the project, we didn't know the sorts of artists that we'd actually be able to have on the project. And we were very surprised and very gratified that we actually had 3 artists, 3 dancers, who right from the very start were interested in participating. So they gave us input into the interaction design and how people move around spaces and those sorts of things. But we also, when we realised they actually were keen to do performances, we thought, well, that's actually a really interesting opportunity to explore how those performances impact interaction and behaviour. So, so that one kind of grew organically, whereas the other 2 were a bit more planned.
I think my question is coming from, I was a bit surprised about the first question. I think it was something, how do people make sense of the installation? I was kind of wondering what you really want to find out there.
I think the idea there is, and we might have a better way of articulating that question, the idea is basically how do people understand how their interactions affect the system, or their manipulations affect the system. So that's where questions like how do they identify themselves when they move into the space? Do they notice the sound effects, and if so, how do they impact what they're doing? Tying their interactions into the effects of the system. I think that was kind of the core that we were trying to get at there, is how do people make sense of this? And there was another interesting aspect of that as well, which is we had 3 separate interaction spaces, but only 1 screen. And we looked at different ways of trying to merge the spaces together to create kind of, joint spaces that were tracked independently on the screen, or dividing the screen up in different ways and representing people from different spaces in different places. We played around with a lot of ideas, or actually the visual artists played around with a lot of ideas for that. Didn't really, it didn't work well to have the space divided, so we wanted to have it all mixed in together. There were various strategies that we used to try and make that clearer to people. So for example, by using different colours for the different spaces that people were in. But that was still a challenge for the interaction design, was how people would be able to kind of put together what was going on in the 3 spaces and make sense of it when there was so much stuff going on the screen.
But it seems it's very, very focused on what actually is happening, and people explore and see their impact. And did you also collect like subjective experiences, emotions?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So we haven't really sorted through that as much as we would like yet, but yeah, we have collected a lot of that. Yeah. Stu.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. One from maybe an HCR perspective, and another one from an RT perspective. I don't know which one to go with first.
HCI one, because I'll probably be able to answer that.
Okay, so it kind of reminds me of the Interactive Dance Rave project from 2000. I don't know, Uyati and Yankiati.
Okay.
Which I think was part of the Kai conference or something.
Mm-hmm.
And was it the first night? I'm going to have to use that. But yeah, they were doing similar things, not with Kinect, but they placed a lot of importance, having done their activity, in rewarding movement.
Okay.
And their approach said that you have to provide rewards for this kind of group interaction form of experience. And I just wondered how you guys kind of shaped up.
What sort of rewards, Jim? You mean a visual reward or something?
Well, their project was definitely more audio based,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a dance rave kind of
Right.
aesthetic, not an ambient aesthetic.
Yep.
And I just wondered, you know, having gone through the same kind of exercise, whether you felt that that was something that came out of it, or perhaps you haven't arrived at that yet if you haven't done all of the data.
Yeah. Well, no, we haven't. But there was an interesting comment that I heard from one person, which was they were under the impression that we were actually doing the project to try and encourage people to move, like it was kind of an exercise thing in some way. Which, I mean, it was a nice side effect, but it certainly wasn't our plan. So it was interesting that I think that fits into the different ideas that people had about what it was and what it was for. But we were certainly trying to encourage, I think we were trying to encourage exploration rather than trying to encourage particular types of movements. And so we tried to build in lots of different types of movements. We were limited by what we could do with the sensor, but within the bounds of that, I think we did quite a lot. And
I keep
yeah.
thinking film, I saw everyone sort of moving around in a group. Like,
Yep.
like a little
Clustering, whenever groups of people, whenever you all joined together, everyone started to spin. Even though nothing ever happened, when everyone got together and they created a cluster, everyone got really excited.
Mm.
Yeah.
Because that was the reward. It's like you got together and you held hands instead of being by yourself. That was the reward. You got to be bigger on the screen.
Yeah, and you also, some of the visual effects had very different ways of representing clusters as well. So you'd appear as a supernova rather than a planet. For example.
That kind of leads me into the next question, which is art. So, I keep on feeling like we live in this age that's like post music, post art, post dance, in a way. Like there are these kind of hybrid forms of emerging, and yet we still use these words like dance and music, and like are they obsolete now? Like when we get into this collaborative space, and you look at someone on the video, like are they actually dancing when they're being really mindful of what's happening on a video screen? And how do we kind of navigate this new artistic space where all of these kind of performative practices that require a certain type of mindfulness may be no longer relevant? And last of all, you know, is it a form of dance or is it a form of art? Is it a collective instrument? Like which one do you kind of
Yeah.
more strongly situated?
That's a very big question I don't feel in any way qualified to answer. I mean, certainly the way that I've described it to people is it's interactive art. That's kind of how we positioned it, but with a very technological bent to it, I guess. Whether it's dance or music or visuals, I really wouldn't want to speak to that. I really have absolutely no clue how the artist would respond to that. Joanne.
I was actually going to say something similar to him, however, he's already said it. But that interactive dance club paper,
Mm-hmm.
that actually came up with 10 rules of engagement. First one was keep it easy for the
Yep.
and on they went. They had done a lot of interviews. It wasn't an HCI kind of paper, although they did do interviews. It was a computer music paper, and they had a lot of funding from American business to do all these projects, and they went around and did put the installations up. There's a lot of information that comes from what I was going to say. There's an enormous amount of work that's already been done on this sort of stuff within the artistic community, like within the computer music community, and there's now a whole lot of symposiums, conferences coming up, poking their heads up, sort of not only in Europe but in America as well, that are dealing with all of this, and they're looking at HCI stuff, but they're coming from the music artistic sensor, computer programming, music computer programming.
Right.
They know a lot of stuff, so it might be worthwhile to expand the research or the looking at what's going on in order to then build on it
Yeah. Yeah, well, certainly we've adopted some of the models mostly from HCI when we're thinking about this. So, like the space model where I talked about, for example, and we've used interaction type metaphors and rhetoric. But yeah, I think you're right. This is as much art as it is interaction, design, and technology. So, we're working quite closely with some of the artists around trying to think about what Encounters was and how to position it and what it means and what we can learn. And some of them, I think, are a lot more in a better position to think about some of those issues than we are, but we're very interested in working with them on it.
Yeah, and there was an electronic age of this stuff too in the 60s. Like in Rome, there was this group called Musica Electronica Viva.
Okay.
And there was this American guy called Richard Titlebaum who ran a lot of these, I don't know, this is kind of in the age of happenings and all this kind of stuff. But they had lights and analog sensors and all sorts of things. And, so it's a really rich tradition to draw on.
Right.
Plus, works from Xenakis and Stockdale's and would probably fit into this category as well.
Right.
Polytopes of Xenakis and
Yeah,
stuff.
cool. Okay, thank you.
All night vigils in churches with lights and lasers and sensors.
Yeah, sure.
People moving around and
Yep.
dancing and not dancing, playing instruments.
Frank.
Just thinking aloud, John, what do you think of possible non-artistic applications of these technologies?
Well, like I said at the end there, I think there's a lot of interesting things you can do when you have a computer understand what's going on in the space. So the approach that we used was, it wasn't particularly novel to do the actual recognition. It was the image detection and that sort of thing was using kind of approaches that other people have used in the past because they are reliable and work well. But we're interested in pushing the technology further so that we can start to infer more detailed information about what people are doing and where they're positioned. Once you have that, then I think you can start doing some really interesting things outside of artistic installations. So you can have rooms responding to where people are standing. So it understands that people are gravitating towards one end of the room or the other. That might be interesting information for a system to know. More implicit interactions around how environments are responding to, or systems are responding to where people are in space and the sorts of formations people are forming. So there's a resurgence in HCI of looking at proxemics and F-formation type research. So being able to actually detect how people are standing with respect to each other and make sense of that and use that as an input to a system, I think is a really interesting way of doing it. So for us, the artistic part of this was just the first application that we're looking at for the same technology. Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast the other day talking about research in England where they're trying to detect, they're looking at crowds moving in public spaces and they can figure out when a fight started.
Yeah.
And how clusters.
Clusters, yeah.
So when a fight's about to start, the movement of the crowd starts to move. That could be useful at white night.
It could be very useful, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is interesting because the sensor really is intended for face-on use, detecting a small number of people, one or a small number of people. We've switched it to a different orientation, which means we can detect a much wider area. And so the sorts of information we get are different, but the volume of information we can collect about a space is a lot different as well. So we're fundamentally, I think we're trying to work towards a situation where we can have sensor technology placed kind of in any arbitrary position around and kind of build an understanding of what's going on in the space and then use that as a way to affect the environment or affect a system at an abstract level. Maybe we'll make this the last question.
Okay, John. Mine's more of a human interaction question. Right? How long did it take for people to sort of feel really comfortable with what you were doing and how you were doing it, and the people that were bringing them into the space itself? And how long did it take for people to think, yeah, this is actually quite cool, we're enjoying this, right? Let's go with it. Or did you have to spend a lot of time sort of, doing a pre-interactive thing?
Well, interestingly, actually, the guy who did all the pre-interaction was sitting over there. Tom was the guy on the door most of the time, and he was actually the one who got people to
Did you have to
feel.
Did you have to spruik? Can I answer that question?
It did require most people before they walked in. Generally, probably like late 20s onwards, early 20s, people didn't seem to care. You walk in and you feel confident with something. Look, it's technology based, and I think people got a lot more confident in that low age bracket to just walk in and figure it out.
challenge that's come through with technology and question whether it's just social characteristics of aging actually. I would be interested to know what younger teenagers did as well, whether they all went to instruction like
Right across the board, yes.
because you know there's a lot of younger people know about technology and they're okay with it, but I didn't think that's necessary. I think it's an assumption, and I think
And then did they act in the same way? It was an interesting part about when the dancers started themselves, they're expecting like a performance as such. So what happens at a performance? People back off because they want the performance to occur. And they're looking at performance like a traditional type of performance. Right? Now, how do you bridge that gap? How do you say, guys, this is part of the whole thing to get involved in this whole thing without, because we're traditionally looking at that from that point of view. Yeah.
Well, some of the dancers actually explicitly did that. They saw people moving away and they said, no, come back, stay.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And it was also, if there were dance performances coming in, you'd say there's an interactive dance performance. They'd be like, oh, so, ask questions or... And there's really like a barrier between some people are just comfortable with something.
So even with all this new technology and everything else, the communication between the people, the project, and that was very, very important.
Yeah, I think it was quite important.
Yeah, well, thank you. And well done too, man. Great work.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.